Okay, so I think we can go ahead and get started. That's it. Okay, perfect. It's so nice to see everyone. Thank you so much for being here on a beautiful Thursday afternoon. So I'm going to start with a question. I wasn't going to, but Damla, you kind of brought it up, so I'm probably sure. As you know, my book is entitled Muslimness in Contemporary Literary Imaginations, 21st Century Muslim Women's Writing in the Diaspora. And Muslim in itself is a charged word. So I am going to be talking about that a little bit because I subverted in my book. But can I ask you to tell me what comes up when we say Islam and Muslims? And we can cut this part out from the, recording. I also think I want to be, writing this book. I obviously, wrote it. I started writing it in the States. So the climate is a little more different than here in Turkey. So the context is the West. That's what I'm looking at, Muslimness in the West, in the diaspora, in the Western diaspora. But I also thought that I always thought I was being vulnerable because you talk about something controversial, something highly controversial, and you're trying to insert your own voice in there. And you're going to, face some backlash for sure, but also you don't want to offend anybody because people are, quite, they have strong opinions and feelings about their Muslimness. So if I were to ask you, like, okay, Islam, what comes up? Like, what's the first thing?
Or Islam, right?
Islam, Muslimness, like anything.
A man.
What is it?
A man with a beard.
A man with a beard, okay.
I'm a fan.
There he is, Ali, basically.
With named Ali.
Related to that, I can say that stereotypes, maybe.
Yeah, a lot of stereotypes, right, comes up, and it's very difficult to even answer the question, like, oh, what comes up when we say Islam? Because you kind of, you're walking on a tightrope. So, what do I say? I don't know. So that really was the, kind of a point of departure for me, that we can't talk about this, and why can't we? And also, just it's a disclaimer, I'm going to do this. I usually love, like when I teach, Eileen, as you know, I love to improvise, but I want to do this conference style. So I want to make sure that I'm being mindful of everybody's time and I'm not digressing. So I will start with, the context, like what is, the 21st century, yes, but what exactly is the context here? So I'm going to start with that, and with how my point of departure for the book is the rising tide of Islamophobia in the global north, what is called the global north. So statistics have shown a stable increase in anti-Muslim sentiments, since 9/11. That's something that we all are familiar with. But what I detected with Trump's infamous Muslim ban in 2016, and I was there when that happened, it was something sharper. What I detected was the hyper-repoliticization of Muslim identity. So since 2005, we have seen a surge in neo-nationalist and anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant political agendas across the Atlantic as well. So the first part of my research process was all about diving deep into the research, right? What is being said about Muslims academically, the surveys, the polls, particularly about Islamophobia, right? So in the post-Muslim ban, October 7th context, in our recent, the most recent context particularly, we see that this politicization has intensified. So we have seen the pledge to reinstate and expand the Muslim ban. We witness European complicity in adopting these exclusionary practices. And we see the continuing, and I highlight the continuing in this context, continuing rise of the surveillance state with directives to screen social media for anti-Semitism, for instance. I don't know, has anyone applied for a visa to the United States recently? You have to actually provide your social media accounts to them. And even though, I lived there for 10 years and I studied there, I'm openly for Palestine and anti-Trump. So, and I'm open about it in my social media accounts. I don't think if I applied, I don't think I'd be, able to get a visa right now. So it becomes a charge that is weaponized to silence political dissent and freedom of expression, really. And these statistics are not just numbers. For my book particularly, they represent the unsettling realities of the 21st century, offering insight into the sociopolitical context. But more importantly, they serve as evidence that identifying or existing as a Muslim in the West creates a shared sense of surveillance and otherization. And, it is this shared pressure that unites diasporic Muslims, regardless of their national and ethnic origin. So in this climate, where Muslimness is equated with threat and terror, and a single version of Islam. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Representation becomes intricate. And of course, representation is political, right? But it just becomes ever more complex. So then, the question arises, who can represent and can speak for Muslims in the current political climate? Now, a disclaimer, I'm a literary scholar, so my question specifically addresses the literary market, as in, who can be categorized and marketed as a Muslim writer, for instance. It has become a capital nowadays. That's something that I talk about in the book, but I'm not going to get into today, and whose representations of Muslimness should be paid attention to, or what kind of Muslimness is being portrayed in our cultural production. And by our, again, I'm talking about the global Anglophone writing, so not Turkey at all. Eastern world is not my context here. So my book argues that to answer any specific questions regarding the plight and positionality of Muslims in the West today, we must turn to the interdisciplinarity between diaspora studies and literary studies. I propose that, following a lot of scholars, I propose that both fields can deepen the other's potential to offer a more comprehensive understanding of the diasporic experience that is getting more and more complex, right? So my study illustrates how imagination and self-representation, along with empirical research. So empirical research is, data, they are valuable, so important. But my point is imagination and self-representation, along with empirical research, can serve as a tool through which cultural processes of globalization and diasporization can be better understood. Yes. Yeah, that's okay.
Just for the non-technical people, can you actually give a definition of what you exactly mean by diaspora in this context?
Basically, people who identify as a Muslim, but people who are residents of the West. So it could be the US. So what I'm looking at writers from the States and Europe, but particularly Britain, because I look at Anglophone writing. So this could be first-generation Muslims, second-generation Muslims, or they could be immigrants, but they identify as a Muslim, so they become part of the group, right? The Muslim diaspora. And oftentimes, in my understanding of it, at least, that's what I'm trying to say, I try to show how the recent context, the current political landscape made it almost, irrelevant for Muslims in the diaspora to just be in a Turkish diaspora, for instance, right? Or in a Pakistani diaspora. So, that can happen, of course, still does, and it has a different, way of functioning. But my focus is, what happens if we take the shared sense of marginalization that Muslims are experiencing in the West, and then they are kind of drawn together. The texts that I look at actually show that the context itself becomes kind of the glue that draws Muslims together, regardless of their ethnicity and nationality.
Not people who moved out.
Yes, absolutely.
People could be born there, but they are just Muslim by second generation, as you said. Or...
Yes, they could be second generation, third generation. Yeah. Thank you, Matteo. So where was I? Okay, this was it. No, that's okay. I love questions. Art and literature. I was going to talk about art and literature, and I think it's unnecessary to talk about the value of art and literature. But I do want to say, both art and literature are distinct in that they can evoke complex emotions and complex feelings. Like, we know that already. And literature in particular, it not only reflects the realities of the human condition, but also actively creates imaginative spaces where alternative modes of existence are or can be envisioned and thus made possible. So the convergence of the two distinct disciplines opens up, for me, some space, productive space for such crucial questions as, okay, how has the notion of Muslimness informed diasporic literary production? Can new approaches to reading Muslim narratives help migrants and citizens of Muslim origin? So, Matteo, I think this also maybe kind of, speaks to your question, right? Migrants, citizens of Muslim origins in the West, make sense of the chaos and ongoing shifts that characterize contemporary experience. So, one thing I would like to say here in regards to the sociological, anthropological research, when I scanned the existing literature on the Muslim diaspora, I found out that the majority of studies used a quantitative approach. And more importantly, Islam almost always meant, Orthodox Islam, as in the Sharia, its legal aspects, right? Prescriptions and restrictions. And for me, this definition clearly excluded the types of Muslimness that I was observing. So for reference, I was in Michigan for 4 years, and Michigan has the highest number of, Muslim Americans. So I was surrounded by them, and I was like, oh, okay. And I was reading, a lot of novels by writers, American writers particularly, who identify as Muslim, and I thought, it really doesn't match here. So there was something missing from the discourse. But of course, getting into the nitty-gritty was quite complex. It was a terminological mess, basically, because in order for me to be able to define Muslim writing, Muslim diaspora, I need to identify Muslim. And that's why I opened with the question, right? It's a difficult question to answer, and mostly because Islam is many things. It's an abstraction, it's an ideology, it's a political tool, it's a religion, it's a philosophy, it's a civilization, it's history, right? It's just a lot of things. So we also know, if we know a little bit about Islam, we also know that there is no authority, and no one really can tell us who a Muslim is exactly. And so let's turn, our focus to the West. Kamila Shamsi, a British Pakistani writer. Has anyone read any Kamila Shamsi? Oh, she's pretty good. But in an interview, she was asked about being a Muslim, right, in Britain, especially a Muslim writer. And this is how she responded. She said, you get asked, are you a Muslim? Yes. And you'll hear all kinds of things being said about Muslims. And you start to feel yourself being Muslim in a way you never felt before. People will say, so what is it about Islam that makes people turn to violence? And so on the one hand, there is the assumption that this religion is deranged. And on the other, there is the assumption that you must speak up for it. Both of these situations are uncomfortable. So Shamsi's statement speaks to how a very specific ontology of Muslimness is inscribed onto Muslim subjectivity, one that centers the perception of Muslims as opposed to the diverse ways Muslims themselves make meaning of their Muslimness. So in my book, I engage with the concept of Muslimness. My definition was, it is a political, cultural, and a spiritual signification. What does that mean? It is how one is read and perceived in the public sphere, regardless of their level of piety or engagement with Islam. What we see today, I mean, this is very important. What we see today is a widespread discursive consensus from Western media to so-called Islamic states in the East. We see this discursive consensus that prioritizes Islam's Sharia, so its legal code, its legal aspects over its philosophy and spiritual diversity. And this narrow focus on prescriptions and restrictions only is the engine that generates the stereotype and excludes the complex lived experiences of Muslims. So in my book, what I ask is, what happens if we, instead of focusing on the perception of Muslims, look at, how Muslim writers, again, that's my literary background coming out, but how Muslim writers in the West are defining and redefining the notions of Muslimness for themselves. So my work focuses on how writers engage in the reclamation of this externally imposed signifier that is Muslimness. And to pursue this reading, I found out that we needed a new multidisciplinary analytical lens that can capture the complexity of Muslimness in the West. So I delved deep into, diaspora studies and Islamic studies. Diaspora studies offers the crucial socio-spatial framework, particularly through, I don't know if anybody's familiar with Altarbra's theory of diasporic space, but it is defined by the complex dynamics of the migratory processes. So settlement, movement, anything in between, basically. And Islamic studies now, that was, I was a bit foreign into that. So I had to do a lot of research, and Islamic studies in itself provides the necessary theological foundation for my argument. Specifically, the late scholar Shahab Ahmed's reconceptualization of Islam supported my definition of Muslimness as a dynamic, contradictory site of meaning. It allowed me to move beyond legalistic definitions. So I want to talk a little bit about Shahab Ahmed's work because it is important. He was a scholar of Islamic studies, but he redefined Islam in his hefty work. It is 600 pages where he is theorizing Islam, but he does that through a historian's perspective. So what he says is basically the rigid boundaries we see today are a modern phenomenon. So he looks at pre-modern Muslim thinkers, and I'll just show you the little visual that I did here. So he's responding to, these are some of the Islamic studies historians' theories that he's basically responding to their claim that Islam has the legal discourse at its center, and everything else, right? Islamic art, literature, philosophy, intellectual engagement, they're on the periphery. But we have the legal discourse at the heart of it. So Shahab Ahmed is using, thinkers, polymaths like Rumi, Al-Ghazali, Ibn Arabi, Khatib Chalabi to say that not really. Islam is all of these things. So Islam is the larger system and context of Islamic thought. We have to look at the pre-modern times and how they dealt with it. It also includes the individual as a human agent, the way in which they make meaning of their Muslimness depending on their context. And then we have explorative, creative Muslim discourses, Rumi's poetry, right? I don't know, the story of Yusuf and Zuleyha, for instance, he analyzes that. The literature, art, music. So for him, the pre-modern Muslim societies were characterized by their ability to tolerate and engage difference, diversity, and also disagreement, all of which cohered to form their everyday reality. So Ahmed's work proves that the legalistic focus we struggle with today, I don't know, like Taliban getting, like destructing the Buddha statues, this and that, right? It's actually a historical deviation. It's not an eternal truth. So what we see here is a deviation. There is so much to talk about when it comes to Ahmed, but the convergence of all these disciplines led me to create my own framework because I needed one to analyze the books that I wanted to study. So I created this term called Muslim diaspora space. You can see its evolution a little bit here to explore the imaginative and lived possibilities of being Muslim today. So Muslim diaspora space, I looked at, I studied, or created it, I guess is the right word here. I created it as a mode of reading or an analytical lens that can bring to focus the ways in which the diasporic experience is not limited to, loss, nostalgia, yearning for a homeland. So these are these are the primary themes for the diasporic experience. But Muslim diaspora space can expose new forms of subjectivities and creative expression that deviate from, strict ethno-nationality or Orthodox Islam in this context. So this is, in a way, it's not something that I'm making up, but I had to rely on empirical data here to see this new formation, this new diasporic consciousness emerging. And then I looked for it in the texts that I analyzed. I have around, in total, let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, I have around like 7 texts, I think, from or by American Muslim writers. They're all women. We'll talk a little bit about why I wanted to write about women particularly. So I theorize Muslim diaspora space in my first chapter, then I move on to post-colonial historical fiction. And today I will focus on my third chapter, which is from Islamic feminism to Muslim feminisms. Let's see if it moves. Hopefully it will move. Okay, yeah, no, that's okay. It moved. So my third chapter, I chose this one particularly because it illustrates this deviation that I just mentioned by examining the ways in which Muslim women and queer individuals who face double discrimination in the current sociopolitical landscape. So Muslim women and queer individuals are caught between religious fundamentalism, extremism on one side, and racialized Islamophobia on the other. Their bodies, sartorial choices, who they sleep with, and other choices, what have you, are controlled by racialized and gendered forms of power. So when we look at media and political narratives, I think all of us can agree that we see a simplistic portrayal of the Muslim women. We have the, liberal, secular, empowered Muslim women, or if you're not that, then you are the oppressed, pious, the victim, right, or traumatized Muslim women. Now, this doesn't mean that some Muslim women aren't forced to do some certain things, right? Obviously, but this is essentially an issue of heterosexual male privilege. But the discourse often overlooks the larger economic systems, patriarchal norms, and the lingering effects of colonialism, even in what we call the global South, that underpin the dominance of these male-centric practices. So the result then is a double bind. Restrictive gender norms are operating equally within both the Western expectations of liberation and Orthodox Islamic insistence on conformity. So they're just kind of stuck in between. Now, historically, I don't want to get into Islamic feminism. It's like a subject, in itself. But just to remind you, historically, in the 1990s, scholars and thinkers of Islamic feminism emerged to resist this dichotomy, this double bind, and they used the Quran to propagate an egalitarian understanding of gender in Islam. So basically, they contested, right, centuries of male-centric interpretations of the text itself. And this movement remains extremely significant still today. But of course, I am going to complicate it a little bit. My reading of the four texts here, exposes Islamic feminism's limitations. Islamic feminism is useful in that it brings to light a pious subjectivity that drives agency only within a heteronormative religious structure. And this is where we need an intervention, because if our goal is to fully understand agency across the entire, secular religious continuum, then we need to ask, okay, if we move beyond this pious, religious framework and use the Muslim diaspora space as our lens, what new kinds of Muslim agency emerge? So the books, I'm going to talk briefly about these, and then I have some of my favorites that I analyzed or published recently, These Impossible Things, and then We Have Always Been Here. I'll talk about them more in depth. But my analysis begins with examining these two particular texts that represent what I call the pious trajectory. It is an early crucial phase of reclaiming the narrative on Muslim women. So we have Minaret by Sudanese Scottish Leila Abdullah, a prolific writer. Her writing is really impressive and really good. And then we have Shelina Zahra Jan Mohammed, a British South Asian writer, commentator. She's a political commentator as well. It's her memoir, Love in a Headscarf. So I'll just, quickly, without getting into too much detail, want to tell you why I label these as texts that, belong to the pious trajectory. In Minaret, Abdullah follows a young Sudanese woman, Najwa, who is a political refugee in England. After being forced to flee Sudan, where she was immersed in a fast-paced lifestyle, marked by excessive socializing, nightlife, and sexual indulgence, she finds her place and stability within a multi-ethnic Muslim community in London. So her agency emerges through an embrace of piety in the diaspora. And this already is an oxymoron for a lot of people, right? I said agency and piety, so it's like, oh, aren't they at odds? But they're not. In Love in a Headscarf, Shelina recounts her search for a husband. It is actually a funny book. It's a chick flick, but kind of like, chick flick Muslimized. And it uses a language that is, that merges Carrie Bradshaw's language with Bridget Jones, It's a lovely one. But the book itself is fundamentally concerned with contesting the normative male-centric readings of the Quran. So Shelina's central project is really the reclamation of her faith, which is for her a process where she separates the spiritual tenets of Islam from the restrictive, again, male-centric cultural practices. So in both cases, the protagonists redefine their Muslimness. They're drawn to other Muslim women in that diaspora space, in London. Well, both of them are in London, actually. So and they find a sense of belonging in this Muslim diaspora space. They interrogate and then eventually dismantle patriarchal norms from, that's the important bit. So they dismantle patriarchal norms from within the framework of their faith. So Najwa, for instance, reclaims the veil. Like, she wears the hijab, even though she wasn't wearing it when she was in Sudan. She goes to London, she does that, and she reclaims a spiritual focus. For her, it's purifying to wear the hijab to go to the mosque, for instance. And Shelina navigates halal dating. That's a thing I learned while reading the book. And familial expectations again. She's from a South Asian family, quite strict cultural expectations. So these texts are absolutely valuable. I mean, it is our job, right, as scholars to complicate things. So even though these texts are very valuable because they prioritize piety and they position feminist concepts of empowerment within Muslim discourse. But the literary market, the majority of readers and even studies on Muslim writing, they tend to promote these texts as the authentically Muslim narrative, right? So these are the authentically Muslim narratives, whereas, I don't know, if you are a Muslim woman, as we will see in a bit in the other texts that I analyze, if you're a Muslim woman who gets abortion or who drinks, then you're secular. It's secular. And also, that's also at odds, right? You can't be a Muslim. You can't really identify as a Muslim. So if these are the only acceptable forms of Muslimness, then obviously we risk establishing a single monolithic model of Muslim womanhood. And, these risk dismissing other voices and those that explore other topics that are deemed un-Islamic. So this brings us to the second half of my analysis, where I examine the two texts that I just mentioned. These Impossible Things by Irish-Egyptian writer Salma Al-Wardani, and then we have always been here a memoir by Samra Habib. She's an Ahmadi Pakistani-Canadian writer, journalist, photographer. A couple of things. No, actually, I'll just go ahead and tell you about These Impossible Things a little bit, and then we'll dive into the close reading part of it. So These Impossible Things is the story of three best friends. We have Jenna, Malak, and Keys, who are Muslim women of different nationalities living in London. So throughout the novel, the characters navigate the tension between their own realities, very specific realities, right? Individual realities as Muslim women living in Britain, Muslim British women living in London in the 21st century, and societal and socio-religious pressures. So they're trying to navigate between these quote-unquote dangerous waters. And the novel moves us from the solitary spiritual journey that we see in works like Minaret and Love in a Headscarf, because the characters in these texts, they kind of, go on a spiritual journey. Pilgrimage is a big thing. It's a big thing, for instance. They go on pilgrimage. It's just them, though, finding their sense of peace and belonging. Here, in these works, we are moving towards the collective. So what does that mean in terms of themes? We have the theme of friendship, for instance, and it becomes quite important within the context of Muslim diaspora space because it signifies the solidarity among women within the diaspora space. The novel is also unapologetic about covering various, taboo subjects such as sex, abortion, interfaith dating, that would be deemed un-Islamic, right? According to the pious trajectory. So Al-Wardani, these subjects, these taboo subjects, according to Al-Wardani, are made impossible, hence the title. So she uses that as a connection. So the differences between These Impossible Things, which, presents what I call the queer and ambivalent trajectory, and Minaret, for instance. I just want to show you the difference. The differences are stark from the very beginning. So, for instance, here we have the very first chapter, the opening chapter from Minaret, Layla Abdullah's Minaret, which belongs to the pious trajectory, starts with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I mean, how Islamic can you get? It's a beautiful formal technique that she uses, and then the entire novel is peppered with references to Islam. Of course, there is Islamic language, Arabic language in there. So here, minaret, we can see that minaret is framed within a very specific Muslim context. And what I call the, Muslimization of the novel as a genre, we see that throughout the text. Now, we see the same pattern in these impossible things, but I want you to compare the opening chapter. So Malak, this is from Malak's perspective. And literally the first question or the first line is, do you think Eid sex is a thing? Like birthday sex, but just a Muslim equivalent. Malak lifts her head from her books to stare open-mouthed at her friends. Jenna is lying on her stomach, elbows up, chin resting on her hands, with a look on her face that suggests the question's a serious one. Surely Muslim can have birthday sex too, Malak replies. So, it's funny, but it is a serious technique that is being used by these writers. So the context is, the framework is Muslim, but we're just offered a very different type of Muslimness. And I'm going to give you another example. So this is Jenna. These three friends, they're childhood friends actually, who go to the same college. And when we meet them on campus, when they're just having these silly conversations, they're about to graduate. So then the story is really about how they deal with the external forces that they face outside. And one of the most important tensions is Muslim, non-Muslim binary. They date non-Muslim men, non-Muslim British men. And that creates friction in their family. So that's a very serious and important conflict. So this is Jenna. I'll give you the context for this. Jenna is, she is openly bisexual. She is British, Palestinian, and she loves the London nightlife. She prays while intoxicated when she's drunk, but she also identifies as a Muslim. And as a Muslim, she openly cultivates a deep relationship, tries to cultivate a deep relationship with God. So she prays, attends the mosque, reads the holy book, not because she's forced to, not because she's supposed to, but because engaging in these activities is a crucial part of her identity as a British Muslim woman. So this particular bit is when they are at a wedding, all the friends sing. Jenna, Keys, and Malak are at a wedding, and Jenna shows up drunk. And she's wearing her headscarf, she's wearing her modest dressing, but I think she broke up with someone, or she had an issue. So she drank a lot before she appears, and then the call to prayer goes off. So they're having a wedding. A South Asian family is having a wedding at a church in England, a Muslim family, of course, but they turn the recital on. So people start to gather and they're going to pray, and this is what happens. Jenna begins to float toward the prayer lines, and Keys, looking instantly panicked, grabs the back of her dress, hissing, "Jenna, you're drunk, you can't pray to God now." "Trust me," says Jenna, patting Keys' arm with a faraway look in her eyes. "This is when I need him the most." She walks away from them to stand shoulder to shoulder with the other women who were getting ready to pray at the back of the room. So Jenna's attitude toward Islam, this is just one example, of course. The novel is filled with passages and examples like this. It models a break from orthodox authority, right? The legal code of Islam, if you will. And reading the novel through the lens of Muslim diasporic space brings to focus how this isn't necessarily a rejection, but a complex negotiation of her faith itself. And Jenna explicitly privileges spiritual necessity over strict adherence to legal codes, kind of in a vacuum, like with no meaning or whatsoever. So her attitude suggests that Muslim spirituality can be entirely adaptive operating in continuity with the full complexities of modern human experience in the 21st century. Now, next, I'm not going to read all of it, but there's a beautiful passage from Jenna's section that further exemplifies her Muslimness, her Muslim subjectivity as ambivalent and complex. So this is from her Quran recitation, her weekly Quran recitations that she attends. Right before she attends her recitation this Thursday, she, goes out, she goes on a date and then goes out and hangs out with her friends at the bar, at the pub. And then the next day, she is forgetting about the guy that she was dating. So she's kind of, what is the opposite of womanizer, right? She has that character. But then she slips into the sister's room in the mosque, the way she has done every Thursday night, and takes her place in the circle of women reading the Quran. She feels a homecoming of sorts. So let's do a little bit of close reading, something that Adi, you're used to, right? We do that a lot in our classes. So the text describes her slipping in to the mosque. And this implies not only a seamless transition, right, just the word itself, but an innate ability to navigate between the, what could be called the private institution of Islam and the secular public space, which could be what London is in itself a secular public place, bars, restaurants, what have you. So she refuses to see them as diametrically opposed because she takes her place. It's rightfully hers. The fact that she drinks, the fact that she goes on dates, that does not negate her Muslimness for her. She takes it. And I don't think we need to read into homecoming, right? It feels like home to be there. And then she sits with her mom and the little green gold book, which is the Quran, in her hands, feels like an anchor. So this theme of, feeling at home there is perpetuated. It's reinforced by anchor, the word anchor. And with every turn of the page, something washes over her that feels like stillness. And this part is also quite interesting. So they're reading the Quran. She's, someone is reading the Quran out loud and she's following it. So she says, the Quran, or she feels, and the narrator says, the Quran floats through Jannah and up into the room, dripping down the walls, hanging off the ceiling. At some point, the light outside the windows changes, but no one notices. Later, when they leave the building, they will comment that the stars are brighter tonight, and they won't know if that's true or if they themselves are brighter. They sit, bodies folded around each other, women, young and old, who have gathered from different countries, all following the same lines of curled Arabic letters, bodies swaying ever so slightly as the word of God vibrates from a woman's throat so beautifully that at one point or another, it brings them all to tears. So what I really like in the last passage particularly is the Quran floating through her, dripping down the walls. So this imagery symbolizes the discursive fluidity of the Quran, the fact that it is open to contextual readings. Islamic scholars like Shahab Ahmed, there are others like Raj, they see the Quran as a living text. So the passage itself refers to that, particularly here. It's quite clear. And it's kind of surreal too. So the surreal imagery of the book floating through the circle of women as well. So it's not just Jannah, but it kind of floats around, right? That serves as a visual representation of Muslim feminist praxis itself. It's a fluid, critical engagement with the text. And this scene is crucial because it resignifies the mosque for Jannah. It's not a site of patriarchal restriction anymore, but it's a transnational space. There are women from different nationalities and so forth, where she can reconcile her fragmented self and finding a belonging that can transcend specific national, ethnic, cultural highest borders even. So a wonderful example of the Muslim diaspora space that I'm trying to create in my book. Now, this is Malak from the same chapter at the wedding. Let's read this first and then we'll talk about it. But we can talk about it a bit more in detail. This is Malak, the other friend, the second of the three. Malak takes a gulp, and as the sharp alcohol hits the back of her throat, she laughs bitterly. It's funny, isn't it? I've talked to God more over the last few weeks than I have in my whole life. I've followed the rules in ways I never used to. Bent my spine 5 times a day in prayer, stayed sober, and definitely haven't had sex, and yet I've never felt further away from him. But all the times we've gone out and I've drunk, ended up at the bottom of a bottle, I swear I've seen God, felt him right there in my chest, or even naked in bed with Jacob, her boyfriend that she's forced to break up with. And here in a churchyard surrounded by Muslims, following the rules like they always told us to, he is nowhere to be found. So a little bit of a context here. These, few weeks that Malak is talking about refers to the weeks she has after she forces herself to break up with Jacob, her non-Muslim English boyfriend. And it's quite interesting because she breaks up with him because she anticipates rejection and ostracization. She doesn't even tell her parents or her family about Jacob, but she anticipates it. Because the pressure is quite, it's quite intense. So she feels that pressure. And like I said, the Muslim, non-Muslim binary, it continues throughout the novel in each character's lives, really. But it's important because, according to Islamic law, you may know, a woman cannot be married to a non-Muslim, whereas a Muslim man can. Now, I have read a lot of theologians and scholars who contest that, saying, well, we're living in the 21st century. Women should have, especially women in the West, should have the same rights as men in the West because the context is quite different. They live within that space. But of course, Malak cannot necessarily talk to her family about this because they have strict adherence to this as kind of an unchangeable rule. So the novel complicates this prescription, though, by exposing the gendered aspects of it. There are so many examples of this, but one that applies to Malak is that her brother, he dates a British woman, not even Christian, atheist, I suppose, Elizabeth, and all the family knows about Elizabeth. The dad makes jokes about it. Oh yeah, Elizabeth, like Elizabeth the Queen. So Malak, of course, internalizes this, right? Where he can do it, but why can't I? So then she tries to find comfort in, reading the Quran. These few weeks, she dedicates herself to reading the Quran, to praying, just to get some sort of an answer. But nothing really comes up. And then we see this, it's so interesting because I was, when I was working on the book, I was looking at the patterns that emerge in these books. And one pattern that emerged in this and other books as well is that the more people or Muslim, women or men are forced to do something, forced to follow the rule of God, the Sharia, if you will, the legal rules, the more they feel estranged from God. This happens to all the characters. They start questioning their relationship. Keys, for instance, the lawyer, she has a Catholic boyfriend and a fiance, Harry, and she's South Asian, and her family absolutely rejects her, saying you cannot marry a Catholic person. And she tries to find loopholes, as you guys can see in this particular passage. She reads, Rumi, she reads other texts, trying to find loopholes, trying to make her parents really understand. But of course, that doesn't happen. And she goes ahead and gets married to Harry. despite her ostracization from her family. And her decision to marry Harry provides the most direct act of resistance in the book. She resists these cultural norms. And I love that she faces her mom somewhere after she marries Harry, and she says, this isn't Islam. And in a way, she can say, like, I've done the work, right? She has a lot of evidence. She read the Quran, she read the interpretations. She says, this isn't the Islam you and Abaji, father, taught us. This isn't what the Quran says or what the Prophet preached. So don't tell me it's because he's not Muslim, Harry is not Muslim, and then tell me it's about God. When my uncle brought home a baby boy and refused to marry the mother, and you still talk to him. So this is where we see the gendered aspects of it, right? I came back with a ring on my finger and a man who loves me, who will spend his whole life standing by my side, which is more than I can say for my own family. And you want to talk to me about what's right and wrong? So what is it really about? She says. And, her perseverance is inspiring. It shows that autonomy, staying true to yourself, even when painful, is ultimately more crucial than complying with a rigid legalistic code that doesn't make any sense to you in context. So I'm going to make the shift to the final text. We Have Always Been Here by Samra Habib, a queer Muslim memoir. So like Muslim women, queer Muslims often walk a tightrope between two rejecting worlds. And on one side here too, we have Orthodox Islamic values that brand them as blasphemous. And on the other, we have liberal progressives that tend to fail to accept that they can be both queer and have faith, right? And Muslim. So this brings us to Habib's work, which offers a holistic picture showing us that the queer Muslim experience is not just defined by trauma of rejection, trauma of trying to fit in, right, what have you, but by resilient joy, solidarity, and connection. So Muslim diaspora space as a lens, in my conclusion, I make a huge list. It can bring to focus, it can help us focus in on different things, but this is the one that I focus on, focusing on not just the trauma of diasporic experience and even otherization, but the connections that emerge and creative expressions that emerge as a result of it. So, see here, queering. I do think that we need to talk about this a little bit because, again, it's one of those terms that may mean different things. When I use the term, you can kind of see my trajectory here. When I use the term queering in this book, I'm using it as a verb. So it's an active critical tool. So queering is an intersectional inquiry. That's not just about sexuality. It moves beyond sexuality, questioning the assumed boundaries of gender, race, nation. A lot of queer theorists like Heather Love, Judith Butler, they actually propose this notion of queering. And queering Islam, even though it may sound kind of paradoxical, or it may sound like an oxymoron, it is a methodology that reveals how the gaps and silences in the Quran and Hadith literature have been historically examined through a historical lens. So I draw on theologians like Scott Kugle, who argue that diversity, including sexual diversity, is a positive reality, and it's a sign of God's intentionality, not a sin. So queering in my book allows for the disruption of both Islamic heteropatriarchal principles and also Islamophobia. So Samra, just a couple of things about Samra Habib. Has anyone actually heard of Samra Habib? Yeah, you have, Ikram. Yeah, okay, so she, as an Ahmadi Pakistani, she and her family are threatened in Pakistan by Islamic extremists. That's around when Pakistan was becoming, or was starting to use Sharia as their form of governance. So then the entire family flees to Canada. So her early life is defined by this dual pressures, plural even, of migration. And the entrapment of the arranged marriage at the age of 13. So she's Canada. She finds out that this cousin that her family brought with them, they actually are planning to marry her at the age of 13. And there is this sense of familial surveillance. And her critical focus here in this book is how these deeply ingrained practices are mistakenly sanctioned as Islamic, whereas they're just restrictive cultural norms. Here's a passage. She says, "In my world, every move was carefully inspected for any traces of sin, usually by my parents, but also by other Muslims from the mosque who felt compelled to keep an eye on me, just as my parents kept an eye on others' children, so that no one would go astray." I mean, we're talking about like 7-year-olds, 10-year-olds or 13-year-olds. So going astray means talking to boys at school or wearing makeup. So here she refers to an incident where she wears makeup and her parents see it and her dad calls it azad. So she writes, "Azad is a funny word in Urdu. In most instances, it means freedom. Freedom from your captors or oppressive regimes. But when used to describe a woman, it is meant to imply that she's too wild to be tamed by those who have the right to tame her. Her parents and all the men in her life whose honor it is her duty to prioritize before her desires. It's also used liberally to slut shame and put down a woman who shows any sign of autonomy or independence." So the label azad, freedom, is very clearly, she tells us, weaponized to mean too wild to tame by men, reinforcing the patriarchal control over women's bodies. This is a line that I really like, though. She says, "One day I would wear the title of azad like a badge of honor." It's kind of her book, right? She is wearing it like a badge of honor here. So then I'm just going to, be quick here. If you're interested, though, you should absolutely read her story. It's inspiring. But when she's of age, she leaves her marriage and she elopes. She leaves home. And then, of course, she has a, very difficult period in her life afterwards. But during this time, she finds her support system in her, what she calls chosen family, which is a cornerstone of, cornerstone of queer culture that fills the void left by their biological family. And then she travels across Japan, she comes to Turkey, Europe, and all her travels also serve as metaphorical journeys toward self-realization, right? Finding out who she really is, her true identity. So it is a journey that is arduous, though. It's painful as she feels like an outsider in Canada, excluded by the Muslim community, right? Even excluded, ostracized by her family. And then she also is ostracized by the secular queer community in Canada for her faith. As in, there's a part where she talks about how she can't see anyone like herself. She just feels out of place in those spaces. That is until she discovers Unity Mosque, which leads her to her photo project, Just Me and Allah, where she brings together photos and stories of queer Muslims from around the world. So she comes to Turkey for that reason too. She takes picture of queer Muslims and then just presents it in her project. And the project's purpose is to, of course, create a discursive space for unheard queer Muslim voices and to shift focus from trauma and suffering to empowerment, to agency, to being like, we're here and we are invisible, which is quite courageous, if you ask me. So she talks about a couple of subjects, her couple of first subjects actually for her photo project. Shirin is one of them. The figure of Shirin is quite interesting. She's the queer Iranian action figure. That's what Samra calls her, who skateboards in short skirts while wearing a hijab. And she perfectly embodies for Samra at least, the unapologetic intersection of faith and individuality. So she proves to Samra that there was no one way to be a Muslim. And we also have Zainab from Tunisia, a trans woman from Tunisia who lives in Toronto. So these are also photos from her project. Zainab says, "We have always been here. It's just that the world wasn't ready for us yet. Today, with all the political upheavals in the Muslim world, some of us, those who are not daily threatened with death or rejection, have to speak for others. They have to tell stories of a community that is either denied or scorned. Together, through facing distinct realities, we should be united. United in the desire to be, in the desire to enjoy being free, safe, and happy." So it's very clear that the majority of queer Muslims in the West are looking for their space, a place where they can, a space where they don't feel out of place. And Habib's project creates a platform for that. And also the Unity Mosque, which is an important journey or important threshold, I would say, in Habib's life. It's an actual mosque in Toronto, an LGBTQ plus mosque that embraces everyone, anyone, and everyone. You can be queer, you can be lesbian, you can be gay, you can be, quite pious. The first time she actually goes there, she's quite hesitant because she's shunned by her community's mosque because she divorced her, I don't know if it's my husband, but just it feels wrong, right? She was only 13. But the Unity Mosque is very important for my purposes because it itself serves as the physical embodiment of Muslim diaspora space. It creates a non-hierarchical site that subverts the rigid binaries of both Orthodox Islam and Western queerness. So what we see here, there is no gender segregation, for instance, in Unity Mosque. We see a diverse congregation praying side by side, from a middle-aged butch from Egypt to transgender refugees from Algeria. And so this space openly proves that the unconditional acceptance of difference is not a fiction. And that's one of the reasons why I'm using memoirs in my book as well. It's not fiction. It's not an imagined, it's not an imagined fictitious effort, but it is a reality. So it clearly disrupts the conventional hierarchies and really affirms for Samra that one's version of Islam is shaped by the intersection of, geography, class, history, and not just codes, not just rules. Now, I do want to read this because when she goes to the mosque, a Black trans woman in her 20s, she gets up and she recites the call to prayer. And Samra feels emotional. It's the first time when she feels like she's accepted ever in her life. So she says, for the first time, I was witnessing a version of Islam I could be a part of. After being scalded and frozen out, I now felt that Islam was welcoming me back into its arms. It had been an awful lonely time, and I was glad to be in the company of people who didn't ask me to change who I was in order to share space with them. I had finally found my people. And now, even though we don't hear about queer Muslims, especially within the Turkish context, queer Muslimness in itself, it's theoretically supported. It's just that, for reasons that we all know, for a system to work, right, a patriarchal system to be maintained, we don't have access to these interpretations. I, for instance, read a lot of a lot of feminist readings of the Quran, just by by female imams, by female theologians. And I remember one time I was telling my mom about my dissertation too. I was like, oh, I read this book and it's a wonderful, the surah about the hijab, she talks about the etymology of the word, isn't that? And my mom said, well, isn't this blasphemous? I'm like, okay, there we go. Yes, that is the common response. But interestingly, again, theologians and scholars like Kugle, we have others, Ludovic Muhammad, for instance. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we have a lot of scholars really who claim that, who reread the Quran by using Islamic feminist methodologies, and they often use the story of Lot, for instance, because that's the only bit in the Quran that talks about homosexuality, and it's very brief. So these scholars are rereading the story, and they claim that sexual identity is not directly addressed in the Quran. It's not direct. You can read between the lines. You can actually reinterpret what was being said. And I love this because they say, well, if you want to say that, you can't be a homosexual, you can't be queer, gay in Islam, then the burden of proof rests on you. So you need to find evidence from the Quran. And it's almost impossible to find solid evidence from the Quran that says it's a sin to be queer. So I just wanted to, mention this because it's those are dangerous paths, as one might say. But overall, going back to Habib's memoir, it transformed the mosque itself from a site of policing. That was her experience. She was being policed into a site of self-exploration. And by finding kinship based on shared experience rather than traditional lineage, nationality, right, common nationality, Samra moves beyond the normative discourse on Muslims. So instead, we see a story of empowerment where the Muslim diaspora space becomes a launch pad for creativity, resilience, hope, and joy. So the comparative, and this is the last bit, but the comparative reading, I wanted to make sure that I did, a lot of comparative readings in my book, because it really asks us, it kind of forces us to get outside our comfort zone and asks us to expand our definition of Muslimness and Muslim feminisms, what that might mean. And we see that agency is not monolithic, and agency oftentimes is contextual. And for some Muslim women, it looks like, agency may look like intimacy within the boundaries of religious ethics, or, or it could be wearing the hijab, for instance. That could how they actually be agents in the world. And for others, it may look like reclaiming sexuality as a central act of freedom. So the power of Muslim diaspora space and my intentions behind creating it was that it can hold both truths. Really, doesn't have to be one or the other. Rather than pitting the pious against the secular, my book brings these writers together to depict Muslim women as complex agents who are successfully navigating the pressures of faith, culture, society in diverse, authentic, and also Islamic ways. Thank you.